Welcome to Charleston Harbor, December 1863, where the sea fell silent and the lanterns beneath the waves refused to die. They said it began after the night the USS Housatonic went down, the first warship in history, sunk by a submarine, the Confederate H.L. Hunley. The harbor swallowed both hunter and prey, iron meeting iron in a single flash of light that faded into darkness. But weeks later, when Union divers descended to recover the wreck, they claimed the darkness wasn't empty. Lanterns, real ones made of brass and glass, still burned below. It made no sense. No oxygen, no air, no hope for flame. Yet reports surfaced, hushed, scribbled in the margins of the Navy's December dispatches. Divers said they saw lights pacing through the wreckage as if the crew were still on duty, keeping watch over a ship that no longer floated. One name stood out: Lieutenant Isaac Fuller, a naval engineer turned diver. He recorded what he saw with the precision of a man trained to measure pressure and depth. Not belief. But the words that survived from his notes tell another story. The light moved, not with the tide, not with the current, but in deliberate patterns, as if guided by unseen hands. The official explanation blamed phosphorus, that faint natural glow that clings to decay. But phosphorus doesn't rise in the shape of men. It doesn't drift from cabin to deck, then pause at the bow where sailors once prayed. Something was alive in that stillness, or something refused to leave. Fuller volunteered to return to the wreck alone. 2 nights before Christmas, he tied himself to the descent rope and slipped beneath the surface. Above him, Charleston burned cannon flashes painted the horizon red. Below him, the world was iron and silence. When he resurfaced, he said little, only that the water was colder than before. His crew noted that the lantern he carried down was still lit when he came back up. He insisted it hadn't touched air the entire time. No one could explain it. Some tried, others prayed. Most stayed silent. In the weeks that followed, fishermen on the harbor began to whisper. Strange reflections at low tide. Not moonlight, not phosphorescent algae, but small amber circles pulsing from beneath the surface. They would fade the moment anyone rowed near. Children along the docks said they could hear faint tapping through the water at night. A slow, deliberate rhythm, like wrenches turning on metal. When the war ended, Charleston's wrecks remained iron coffins half buried in silt. The Navy sent survey teams to map them, and each report noted odd readings, brief spikes of light untraceable to any cause. The pages were stamped and archived, but one line appeared again and again in marginal notes. Unexplained illumination persists. Local folklore began to take root. Dock workers said the sea carried memory like salt, that every tide brought back a fragment of what had been lost. Widows lit lanterns on the shore, one for each sailor never found. On windless nights, those on watch swore the lights on land would dim, and across the harbor faint amber glows would flicker to life under the water, answering from below. Decades later, long after the city rebuilt, long after the war's noise faded into textbooks, the story refused to die. During the 1930s, government interviewers from the Works Progress Administration came to Charleston to record local legends. Elderly dockhands spoke of the same glow their fathers had described. One called it the harbor that breathes light. Another said simply, they never stopped keeping watch. Historians today dismiss it coincidence, chemical reaction, the shimmer of disturbed minerals. But none can explain why the lights pulsed like signal lamps, or why identical accounts surfaced nearly 70 years apart. The legend says, Lieutenant Fuller's final entry, the last line from a water-damaged logbook found near Fort Sumter, read only 4 words: the lanterns still burn. And so they say they do. Divers in the modern era claim that sonar scans of the Charleston wrecks show rhythmic echoes, flashes repeating at steady intervals, unconnected to any living source. The lights no longer shine to the eye, but to the machines that see beneath the silt, they still answer. Welcome to the story of Charleston's iron wrecks, where history and myth lie rusted together under a century of salt, and where the line between the living and the remembered has long since dissolved. Before we begin, share in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening now. Because somewhere beneath this harbor, beneath layers of iron silt and silence, the lanterns that went down in 1863 may still be burning. March 1863. Charleston Harbor breathed smoke instead of salt. The city was ringed with batteries and watchtowers, its streets trembling under the weight of distant guns. On the water, iron met iron, Union monitors drifting like black anvils against the tide, and the Confederate batteries on Sullivan's Island answering in kind. The harbor itself became a theater of echoes, each cannon a heartbeat, each ripple a shudder from the past. Charleston was the jewel of the South, and now its heart was under siege. Every morning the air carried soot, and every evening the same horizon burned crimson before sinking into fog. Across the docks, sailors patched hulls torn by shrapnel. Civilians packed sandbags around their churches. And under every quiet breath, there lingered the question, how much longer can this city endure? The Union blockade had tightened its grip. Steam frigates prowled the outer rim of the harbor like wolves circling a wounded prey. Inside, Confederate engineers built ironclads, strange skeletal machines that looked more like tombs than ships. The Palmetto State, the Chicora, the Charleston, each forged in desperation, armored with salvaged rails and the prayers of men who knew they would never match the North's industry. The harbor waters, dark, thick with ash, hid more than ships. They hid fear and faith. Divers and dockhands spoke in low voices about what the sea was becoming. It's turning to metal, they said. It remembers every sound. The Hunley itself, that narrow hand-cranked cylinder of death, had already become a rumor before it ever sailed. 8 men packed into a tube barely wide enough for their shoulders. No engine, no light. Only the breath they carried and the courage they borrowed from one another. They said the vessel could vanish beneath the waves and strike like a shark, unseen, unstoppable, until it didn't return. Each test claimed another crew. The harbor swallowed them quietly, as if the water had made its bargain. When the final crew volunteered, led by Lieutenant George Dixon, they did so knowing that each bolt they tightened might be the last sound they heard. Yet the Hunley launched anyway, through the dark tide toward the distant glow of the Union fleet. Above on the wharf, women held lanterns in the rain, small trembling flames that swayed with the wind. They watched the horizon, waiting for any sign of return. None came, only silence. Then the faint shock that rippled across the harbor when the Housatonic went down. A minute of triumph followed by years of questions. After the explosion, Charleston erupted in confusion. Some celebrated, believing the tide of war had turned. Others stared into the black water, afraid of what victory had cost. No one spoke of the missing crew at first. It was easier to say the sea had claimed them, that their sacrifice was complete. But deep down, even among the hardened officers, there was unease, a feeling that something beneath the harbor had changed forever. The Navy's reports from those months paint a portrait of exhaustion. Men rotated through duty with hollow eyes. Supplies dwindled. Disease crept through the camps like mist. Rats, they wrote, were easier to catch than fresh water. The harbor stank of coal and sweat and iron filings. Engineers worked by candlelight, hammering armor plates in rhythm with distant cannon fire, the same sound day after day, like a drum keeping time for ghosts. Charleston itself had become a city of half-silences. Every conversation carried weight, a pause before the next shell, a glance at the sky to see if the air itself had turned to smoke. Churches opened their doors to the wounded. The bells rang less often, their sound swallowed by thunder from the bay. Out on the water, sailors began to whisper that the harbor was listening, that when a cannon misfired, the echo lasted too long, that when a ship sank, the waves took longer to close. They called it superstition. But superstition spreads fastest where death is common. Letters from the time speak of these small terrors. A surgeon at Fort Sumter wrote of treating a diver pulled from the wreck of the Isaac Smith, a man who refused to speak eyes wide, insisting he'd seen lights moving in the deep. A Confederate sentry on Castle Pinckney claimed that at night the bay glowed faintly where the ships had gone down like embers breathing under the tide. The human mind seeks order, but war breaks it apart. And in Charleston, the line between faith and fear had dissolved completely. Even the engineers who built the ironclads began to treat the machines like living things, patting their hulls before launch, whispering prayers into the rivet seams. The boats were baptized with champagne salt water and gunpowder smoke. One officer wrote that he felt the ship shudder as if it had lungs. By autumn, the city was trapped sea to the east siege lines, to the west sky thick with smoke. No one knew how many ships now lay beneath the harbor floor. Some said 5. Others said 9. Each a steel tomb, and each in the eyes of Charleston's people a story unfinished. The folklore grew because the facts left silence behind. When official reports ended with status unknown, the imagination filled in the rest. People began to speak of the iron dead, not as ghosts, but as a presence, a weight in the air. Lanterns along the docks burned lower at midnight, and the old fishermen would nod and say, "They're walking again." To an outsider, it might sound like myth. But to those who lived through the siege, it was memory, mixed with fear, wrapped in salt and smoke. The harbor was no longer a body of water, it had become a body of stories. By December, when Isaac Fuller arrived with the Union recovery team, the harbor had already become legend. The tides had shifted with the war, not just in maps and front lines, but in the minds of those who stood on its shores. Fuller came armed with instruments, not faith. He was a man of depth gauges and pressure valves, and he believed what the sea could be measured, it could be mastered. But the people who watched him prepare his descent said otherwise. An old dockhand told him, "If you go down there, don't call their names." Fuller smiled, but the words stayed with him. Because even as he checked his rope and lantern, even as the surface rippled around him, something in the harbor seemed to breathe. Every harbor has its silence. Charleston's was heavier. It pressed on the lungs, crept into the mind, lingered like a second heartbeat. Ships rotted at anchor flags, hung limp gulls, circled without sound. The war still raged beyond the horizon, but here, in this circle of iron and memory, time had slowed. And when Fuller finally stepped off the dock that night, the water closed around him like a door. Above him, the lights of Charleston shimmered below him. The lanterns waited. No one in the city slept easily after that. The harbor had changed, and so had the men who entered it. Charleston, 1863, a city under siege, a harbor full of wrecks and whispers. And somewhere beneath that iron tide, the story that refuses to stay buried. Records from the United States Navy, winter of 1863, described Charleston Harbor with precision water temperature 48 degrees, visibility less than 2 feet, sediment density high enough to obscure even the nearest rope line. The divers worked in pairs, each armed with a small brass lantern coated in waterproof grease. The light should have gone out within seconds. Yet it didn't. In the archives of the Naval Ordnance Department, Washington, D.C., a memo still exists dated January 6, 1864. The handwriting is thin and careful. Visibility 0. Lantern light visible at 38 feet depth, inconsistent with known physics. No elaboration, no theory, just the fact recorded, acknowledged, then sealed. By then, Charleston's waters were already layered with wreckage Union ironclads. Confederate rams, blockade runners. Each hull carried its own weight of history, a nameplate, a flag, a cargo of iron and bones. Fuller's team had orders to chart them, measure them, report them, nothing more. But what they found defied every report that came before. At 23 feet down, the first diver's thermometer burst. The second diver reported vibrations, as if the pressure itself were moving. And then came the light. Not phosphorescent, not random, but a steady pulse. 1-2 pause, 1-2 pause. A rhythm too deliberate to dismiss. The Navy tried to quantify it. They sent for chemists, physicists, even a young assistant from the Smithsonian Institution, who later wrote that the harbor glowed in layers, like glass sheets breathing. The official explanation, spontaneous bioluminescence caused by decaying organic matter, satisfied no one. No diver had ever seen a glow follow the shape of a man's hand. Until now. There is a letter buried in the National Archives Series 74B Marine Division, signed by Rear Admiral John Dahlgren, commander of the South Atlantic Blockading Squadron. In it, he instructs cease further descent on site. Record phenomenon as natural. Do not publicize. The underlined word is natural. But the tone clipped uneasy tells another story. Dahlgren's own journals, declassified a century later, reveal his private doubts. The men will not dive again. They speak of the lanterns as if they live. I am forced to treat science with superstition for the sake of morale. Science versus superstition, that was the silent war within the harbor. And Isaac Fuller stood between them. He approached the wreck not as a mystic, but as a man of measurement. His logbooks are meticulous depth-temperature compass bearing pressure per square inch. In one entry, he calculates the precise buoyancy loss caused by iron oxidation, and then writes almost as an afterthought, light still visible at 26 feet. Cannot account for duration. In February 1864, Fuller ordered an experiment. He extinguished his lantern before submerging, carried only a notebook sealed in wax. At depth, he recorded what he saw. Light appeared ahead, stationary amber, in hue increasing with heartbeat. He surfaced 20 minutes later, nearly frozen, whispering, "It followed me." The report reached Washington and vanished from correspondence the following month. What remains is circumstantial requisition logs showing additional lantern oil shipments of diving gear redirected to Charleston and payments labeled experimental equipment, underwater illumination. Historians reading those records today see bureaucracy. But within the margins, written in pencil and crossed out, appear strange notes. Persistence observed. Not reflection, not phosphor. Duration exceeds 30 minutes. Modern analysis of those same lanterns shows their oil composition, whale oil mixed with calcium acetate, could not possibly sustain flame underwater. Yet recovered fragments from Charleston Harbor bear residue of combustion. The physics don't match. The chemistry denies it. And still, the evidence remains. The H.L. Hunley itself, raised from the harbor in 2000, preserved at the Warren Lash Conservation Center, showed traces of mineral carbon fused to its hull, resembling burn patterns. The official explanation calls it post-impact oxidation. But among local historians, another phrase circulates: residual flame marks. Fact or echo? Science or memory? The records don't decide, they only whisper. It wasn't only Fuller's crew who noticed. Union signalmen posted on Morris Island began reporting subsurface glows visible from their observation towers. One entry in the Signal Corps log, March 4th, 1864. Light beneath water, east of wreck, steady duration 9 minutes. The notation ends with a single dash, as if the recorder paused mid-sentence. At the same time, Confederate observers across the harbor reported identical sightings. Though each side blamed the other for trickery, neither could accept that the sea might hold its own illumination. For the next 6 months, no official diver entered the wreck again. The Navy had turned its attention to deeper waters, the blockade, the advance toward Savannah, leaving Charleston to decay quietly in the fog. But the harbor refused silence. Letters from dock workers and harbor pilots preserved in the South Carolina Historical Society describe nights when the water gleamed like iron, heated from within. They speak of magnetic needles drifting without cause, of compasses spinning even on dry decks. One entry unsigned: the sea hums near the wrecks. It was easy to dismiss until the instruments began to agree. By 1870, engineers testing telegraph lines across the harbor recorded electrical interference at frequencies consistent with moving light sources. They called it electrosaline distortion. To locals, it was simpler. The lanterns still burn. Every piece of evidence had an explanation, yet none fit completely. Lantern glass recovered decades later bore soot inside, not outside. The lamp wicks were preserved as if burned in vacuum. The oxygen would have been gone within minutes. But the residue said otherwise. Physicists ran experiments in controlled tanks replicating depth and pressure. None could recreate sustained combustion. And yet, when sonar mapping began in the 1980s, anomalies appeared exactly where Fuller's coordinates had been marked, points of recurring reflection pulsing every 42 seconds. 42 seconds, the same rhythm recorded by the 63 divers. Coincidence, maybe? Or maybe the harbor was still keeping time to something that never stopped. Facts anchor belief, but sometimes they only deepen the mystery. Charleston Harbor remains one of the most thoroughly documented battle sites of the Civil War. There are ledgers, drawings, diagrams, surveys, and sonar scans, each precise, each verifiable. And still amid that mountain of proof, one truth endures: the phenomenon never ceased. When naval researchers returned in 1999 to study sediment density around the Hunley site, their report ended with a curious line. Light anomalies continue. Instruments calibrated twice. Source unknown. More than a century later, the same words. And so the records agree on everything, except the one thing that matters most: why the lanterns, by all law of nature, never went out. They shouldn't have burned that long. They shouldn't have burned at all. But Charleston's harbor has never cared much for what should be. The harbor was quiet that morning, almost reverent, as if the water itself waited. The wind had dropped, the gulls had vanished, and the city behind him whispered in smoke. Charleston, a skeleton of towers and chimneys, watched in silence as one man prepared to go below. Lieutenant Isaac Fuller checked each strap, each latch, each line. His breath condensed in the cold, forming small ghosts that vanished before they reached his chest. Around him, the recovery crew moved with slow efficiency, men who had seen too much, said too little, and trusted only what they could touch. He was 31, an engineer before the war, a believer in numbers, not omens. But the harbor had a way of unmaking certainties. He'd read every report, every record, every test, and still the same question remained. Why does the light continue? As he lowered himself toward the water, a dockhand, older eyes, gray with salt, muttered, "Don't call their names." Fuller nodded politely, though the warning felt heavier than it should. He adjusted his rope, set his lantern on the crate beside him, and watched its flames shiver in the morning air. The reflection on the harbor surface rippled as if something below had exhaled. He descended slowly, rope sliding through calloused hands, the light above dimming to a single trembling coin. The world narrowed, water pressing in, sound folding away. At 15 feet, the harbor's skin closed over him completely, and daylight was gone. Fuller lit his lantern. For a moment, nothing. Then faintly, the glass glowed amber, steady, and calm. He could see perhaps a yard in every direction, silt drifting, threads of grass, fragments of rope. The wreck lay ahead, massive, silent, its hull scarred like the ribs of a whale. He reached it by touch, metal cold as ice, rough with barnacles. Each inch was a story, a dent where a shell had struck a line of rivets holding memory together. He moved along the side, careful counting paces, recording mentally what he saw. Then he stopped. Light, not his own. A pulse, faint, rhythmic, glowing from within the wreck's broken seam. He steadied himself, thinking of phosphorus, of reflection, of tricks of the eye. But the pulse continued. Once. Pause. Again. Always the same. He brought his lantern closer, and it brightened as if answering. Fuller froze. Pressure thundered in his ears. He whispered to no one. "That's impossible." But the sound went nowhere, lost to the current. The glow deepened. Not wide, not scattered, focused. 2 points, level, watching. He took a step back, almost losing his footing. The water stirred, faint vibration through the hull. Not movement, but resonance, like a song remembered by metal. He felt it through his palms, through his chest. Fuller forced himself to breathe evenly, counting seconds, a habit from training. 1 inhale, 2, 3. Still the rhythm inside the wreck matched his heartbeat. 1, 2. Pause. He reached for the rope. Stopped. Something in him, curiosity or something older, told him not to flee. He floated there, suspended between reason and fear, and slowly raised his lantern toward the open hatch. Inside, the faint outline of a figure. Not clear, not solid. More suggestion than form. A man, perhaps bent over, arm extended, as if tending to something unseen. Fuller blinked. The shape dissolved. Only the light remained. He tried to speak to record, to remember, but words didn't belong down there. Only the pulse of water and the creak of iron settling in the mud. He felt for the first time that the harbor was alive, that every drop pressed against him with intent. When he surfaced 20 minutes later, his face was white with salt, his hands trembling. The crew pulled him onto the dock. He said nothing. They waited. Finally, he whispered, "It's still burning." The men glanced at one another. Someone laughed nervously, but it didn't last. Fuller placed the lantern he'd carried on the dock. The glass was warm, the flame steady, and when he opened the vent to blow it out, the flame refused. It held like a small defiance of physics. That night, Fuller sat alone in the quarters overlooking the harbor. He tried to write, but each line faltered halfway through. Depth 27 feet, glow observed, source unknown. His handwriting became less precise, more human. Finally, he stopped and stared at the paper until the ink bled. Outside, the fog rolled in low, thick, crawling over the docks like smoke with memory. He could see the lanterns of other ships rocking gently in the distance. Then faintly, one more light appeared where no ship lay anchored. It moved slowly just beneath the surface. He stepped out, boots sinking in wet wood, and watched. The glow drifted closer, paused near the pilings, and vanished. The air was utterly still. Fuller exhaled long, slow, as if the harbor had taken his breath in exchange. He would dive again 2 days later, against orders. Perhaps to understand, perhaps to prove he hadn't imagined it. The crew warned him. Even his commanding officer, Dahlgren himself, had written that no further dives were necessary. Fuller ignored them all. He wrote in his journal that night, "If the harbor remembers, I must ask what it once remembered." The following dawn was cold, the kind of cold that stiffens the ropes and makes the sea look like hammered steel. Fuller descended for the last time. What he saw, no one can confirm. What he wrote, only fragments survive. The final pages warped, water-stained, the ink faint but legible, not reflection, not light. The lanterns are watching after that silence. His body was recovered 3 days later, caught in the rigging near the wreck of the Shikora. No wound, no damage to his gear. The cause listed as oxygen deprivation, but the lantern he carried was found still burning. They placed it on the dock beside his belongings, covering it with a cloth. It burned for hours before it finally went dark. And even then, when the glass cooled, a faint glow lingered at the wick like breath refusing to leave. In the weeks that followed, no diver volunteered for Charleston Harbor again. The reports ended. The logbooks closed. The city turned its eyes inland, pretending the harbor was only water once more. Yet those who lived along its edge swore that on certain nights, when the tide fell and the air turned still, a single light would move beneath the surface, slow, deliberate, steady, as if someone was still down there, keeping watch. And sometimes, just before dawn, they said the harbor would breathe. A century passed, and the harbor never gave back its silence. By the mid-1900s, the wrecks of Charleston were no longer battle relics. They were data. Surveyors arrived with sonar geologists, with sampling gear historians, with carbon dating kits. They came not to believe, but to measure. And yet, the deeper they looked, the stranger the numbers became. In 1964, 100 years after Isaac Fuller's final dive, the United States Navy commissioned a series of hydrographic scans across the harbor floor. The report, still housed in the Naval Oceanographic Office, lists anomalies, localized reflective points, exhibiting rhythmic intervals inconsistent with marine interference. In plain words, the machine saw light where there should have been none. Engineers tried to rationalize it. Faulty calibration, perhaps. Electrical echo from ship hulls, magnetic bleed from undersea cables. But the coordinates matched exactly the same sector Fuller had charted in 1863. Each return ping formed a loop pulsing every 42 seconds, repeating, never fading. Modern physics should have ended the legend. Instead, it revived it. In 1987, a joint study between the U.S. Geological Survey and the Charleston Historical Maritime Commission returned to the same wreck sites with magnetometers. What they found defied even instrumentation. At depths between 20 and 30 feet, iron hulls showed residual magnetic charges equivalent to active current, as if the metal still remembered the impact of 1863. The scientists published their data. They called it ferrous echo retention. The papers read like any peer-reviewed study: measurements, graphs, tables, and yet the implication was extraordinary. Energy, once released, had remained trapped within the steel itself, vibrating in cycles, feeding on time. Charleston's folklore, the lanterns that never died, suddenly had a vocabulary of science. Still, skeptics pressed back. They said no energy could persist that long. No current could survive a century beneath salt. But when researchers attempted to demagnetize recovered fragments of the Hunley's hull, the metal repolarized within hours, as if charged by something internal unseen. Some called it residual stress. Others called it coincidence. A few quietly called it memory. By the late 1990s, technology reached deeper than men ever had. High-frequency sonar mapped the wrecks with astonishing precision. One of those maps, taken in 1999, revealed faint halos around several points of the harbor floor, thermal gradients far too symmetrical for natural causes. The thermal imaging technician interviewed years later admitted what the report would not. It looked like heat bleeding from lantern glass. It shouldn't have been possible. There was no power source, no decomposition, no friction. Yet the pattern repeated circular pulsing amber in hue. The following year, when the H.L. Hunley was raised from the harbor mud, the world watched in awe. A submarine lost for over a century, brought back into the light. But beneath the celebration lay a quieter revelation. On the outer hull, corrosion formed in concentric rings, faint scorch marks spiraling outward from the portholes. To conservation experts, they resembled heat shadows. To the locals who had kept the legend alive, they looked like proof. The restoration team tested residue samples, sulfur iron oxide, trace carbon, combustion markers. But how could fire exist in water? No one could explain it. The official statement simply read, "Corrosion patterns under review." Every investigation only tightened the mystery. In 2002, marine biologists studying plankton movement in the same waters noticed irregular luminescence near the wreck sites, brief synchronized flashes. The intervals again matched Fuller's notes. The team logged the phenomenon as biogenic mimicry. But one researcher, a woman named Dr. Ellen Rhodes, disagreed. She wrote privately, "If the living imitate the dead, the signal began somewhere, outsmarted, outproduced, outlived." The harbor had resisted every attempt to classify it. By 2010, autonomous submersibles scanned Charleston Harbor using laser line mapping. On several passes, the sensors recorded faint fluctuations in refracted light, not random, but rhythmic. 42 seconds. Again. the same pulse that had haunted naval divers in 1863 and sonar operators in 1964. It was as if the harbor were still blinking, sending its own Morse code through silt and steel. Historians argued that it was coincidence, pattern recognition, human need for story. Yet deep-water physics offered another possibility. Piezoelectric resonance, the ability of certain metals to generate light under pressure. Perhaps they said the collapsing hulls had trapped energy for decades, releasing it slowly through fractures. But even that theory failed to explain one thing. The light wasn't random. It appeared and disappeared with a rhythm of breath. The engineers called it periodic discharge. The divers called it persistence. The locals called it the watch. Charleston Harbor, through time, had become more laboratory than legend. Every expedition brought machines, sensors, drones, probes. Every return brought more questions. Beneath meters of silt, the wreck seemed to hum. Sonar registered low-frequency tremors inaudible to human ears. Some believed they were geological. Others wondered if the sea was simply speaking back. And yet, through all this, one detail refused to fade: the pattern of the lanterns. Each point of light mapped across the harbor formed an invisible arc, tracing a path from Morris Island to the mouth of the Cooper River, a perfect curve. The same path the Hunley had taken on its final night. Coincidence again? Or repetition, the harbor replaying its own memory in loops too slow for men to see? By the mid-2010s, digital imaging allowed for complete reconstruction of the wreck. Inside, conservators discovered a set of brass fittings, circular mounts designed for lantern brackets. The brackets were fused, melted at points where no heat should have reached. Their surfaces shimmered faintly, even under laboratory light, a soft amber tone that cameras struggled to capture. Tests concluded nothing conclusive: no radiation, no chemical anomaly, only presence. When asked, one of the lead scientists, Dr. Michael Laird, said in an interview, "We can document the phenomenon. We cannot define it. The harbor doesn't behave as physics predicts, it behaves as memory does." It was the most accurate sentence ever written about Charleston. In trying to prove the harbor wrong, they proved its persistence instead. Each generation had arrived with newer tools, sharper sensors, stronger data, and each had left with the same unanswered truth. The lights continued. The pulse remained. They had the mathematics. They had the instruments. But Charleston had time, outflanked by its own past, outsmarted by what it refused to explain, outlasted by the rhythm that still beats beneath its waves. And so the legend returned to where it began. A harbor lined with iron, a story that refuses to stop burning. When sonar operators listen today, they sometimes mute their headsets just before the pulse returns, not because it's loud, but because it feels alive. Every 42 seconds, the signal rises, fades, and begins again. A century and a half of science, and the harbor still keeps its own time. The lanterns had not been extinguished. They had simply learned a new way to shine. By the time the 21st century arrived, Charleston had changed, but the harbor never did. The skyline stretched higher, glass and steel where cannon smoke once lingered. Yet beneath all that light, the old water still remembered. The sea carried a silence that felt alive, too full to be empty, too deep to be calm. In 2013, 150 years after Fuller's final descent, a group of marine historians gathered at the Warren Lash Conservation Center. The Hunley rested there, preserved behind glass and humidity controls, a relic of ambition and tragedy. Among them was Dr. Ellen Rhodes, the biologist, who once said the harbor's glow was biogenic mimicry. Time had softened her certainty, but not her wonder. She pressed her hand to the iron hull, cold-pitted, breathing faint warmth, and whispered, "It's still warm." No one corrected her. No one dared. Sensors were placed along the metal skin, thermal, magnetic, acoustic. The readings trembled. Not noise, not error. A pulse, slow, deliberate, 42 seconds apart. They played the data aloud, a faint rhythmic hum rising, fading, repeating. For a moment, no one spoke, because what they were hearing sounded like life. At the symposium later that year, scholars debated every possible explanation: residual charge, piezoelectric stress, environmental interference. But when Major Henry Caldwell, a descendant of one of the Union divers, rose to speak, the room fell quiet. He said simply, "Maybe we've been looking at it wrong. Maybe the lanterns were never about light, but about duty." The sentence hung there, soft, inevitable. For more than a century, Charleston Harbor had been treated like a riddle to solve. But what if it wasn't a riddle at all? What if it was a promise? The men who went down in 1863 hadn't disappeared, they'd been absorbed into the memory of the harbor itself. Not haunting it, guarding it. The pulse that echoed through water and metal wasn't an echo of death, it was the rhythm of remembrance. Every 42 seconds. One breath of devotion. The silent passing of the lantern from hand to hand, through years, through war, through the slow tide of history. When you stand on the pier today near the marker that reads Hunley Recovery Site, the water looks ordinary, calm, indifferent. But wait long enough until the harbor stills, and sometimes beneath the reflection, a faint amber shimmer moves. Some say it's refraction light bending through silt and current. Others, something else, something patient, because time doesn't erase everything. It only buries what it can't explain. After Fuller's death, his journals passed from Navy custody to private collectors, then finally to the Charleston Historical Society. Most pages are gone, the salt had eaten the ink. But one survived. A single line written in a trembling hand. If light persists without air, it is not flame, it is memory. That sentence, half science, half prayer, inspired a new field of study. Resonant preservation. They called it the theory that matter, when marked by trauma or faith, retains an echo of energy. Like the human heart remembering a loss long after the wound has closed. Researchers tested it: metals from shipwrecks, bullets from battlefields, stone from burned cathedrals. Each carried faint irregularities, energy signatures behaving less like corrosion and more like recollection. Nothing conclusive, but everything possible. Charleston Harbor became their constant, the living laboratory of endurance. Here folklore and physics touched hands. Here the line between myth and measurement dissolved. Modern divers who descend into those waters now speak differently. They no longer hunt for answers, they go to listen. They descend slowly, pause above the wrecks, lower their own lights. LED sharp, artificial, and wait. And sometimes, the old glow answers back. A faint, slower warmth, not reflection, not coincidence, but recognition. As if the harbor itself remembers what it means to be seen. Historians document, scientists calculate, but the people of Charleston, they keep vigil. Every February, on the anniversary of the Housatonic's sinking, hundreds gather at the piers. They light lanterns, paper glass, even electronic, and set them adrift. The tide carries them out one by one, little constellations trembling on black water. Some fade quickly, some drift for miles. And every year, a few begin to sink slowly, gracefully, until the surface swallows the glow. No one panics, they just watch, because they know the harbor is taking them home. The Navy still keeps its files stamped, classified, archived. But even the most skeptical officers admit the same quiet truth. The readings never vanish. The pulse remains. The light endures. No longer a mystery, no longer an accident. Simply continuity. The sea keeps its oaths. The iron keeps its fire. And Charleston keeps its memory. Major Caldwell wrote later, "Perhaps the sea never wanted to haunt us, only to remind us." He stood by the railing at dusk, the cranes behind him, the harbor before him, the water breathing slow. The light was fading, but the surface glowed with a thin amber sheen. A memory caught in motion. He smiled and said quietly, they're still down there, doing their job. That was the moment when the legend finally made sense. It was never about fear. It was about endurance. The lanterns had not stayed lit out of defiance, but devotion. They had burned for duty, for remembrance, for the quiet dignity of men who refused to be forgotten. Even now, when storms sweep across the Carolinas, the Coast Guard logs report strange flashes beneath the surface. They list them as light anomalies. They recalibrate instruments, and still the reports return year after year. Always the same phrasing, the same duration, the same rhythm. Light observed below surface. Duration 42 seconds. The reports end there. No explanation, no cause. Only the lingering note undetermined. And maybe that's exactly as it should be. Because some stories are not meant to be solved, only remembered. And Charleston remembers. When the city sleeps, when fog rolls in soft over the marshes, when the water folds into stillness, the harbor breathes once more. And for that one fleeting moment, beneath layers of salt and iron and time, something shines. Not to frighten, not to haunt, but to remind. That memory, like light, cannot drown. The harbor sleeps now, or pretends to. The cranes are still. The lights along the piers shimmer through mist, and the city behind them hums with a different kind of noise, traffic, laughter, life. But beneath it all, somewhere deep under the waterline, the old rhythm continues. Every 42 seconds the harbor exhales. If you stand there long enough past midnight, when the wind falls quiet, you can feel it. A pulse beneath your feet. A vibration through the pilings, soft, patient, old as sorrow and steady as faith. They say it's just the tide or the slow heartbeat of a working port. But Charleston's old fishermen smile when you ask. They've seen too much to explain it away. They speak in half-whispers, stories passed from father to son of the nights when the water breathed light and the fog glowed from below. Some call them myths, some call them memories. But to Charleston, they are both. For a city built on water and war survival was always an act of remembrance. Each ship that sank left a trace. Each lantern that burned left a promise. And promises have a way of keeping themselves. In the archives, in the glass cases, in the polished halls of museums, the Hunley rests her metal bones silent under perfect light. Visitors lean close, read the placards, take their photographs, and move on. But the harbor, the real harbor, keeps its own exhibit. No signs, no guards, just a surface that reflects the sky, and beneath it, a quiet persistence. Some nights, divers still return not to test, not to prove, but simply to see. They lower their cameras. The screens flicker, and there it is again, faint, rhythmic, impossible. A warmth in the cold. A glow where there should be none. And though the machines record nothing definitive, every diver comes back changed. They speak slower. They look longer at the water. As if something below had taught them patience. Charleston Harbor has become more than a place, it's a threshold. Between what is measured and what is remembered. Between the precision of instruments and the pulse of things unseen. It isn't haunted, it's inhabited. By duty, by light, by all the moments that refused to die quietly. And maybe that's the truth that Isaac Fuller carried down with him that day in December 1863, when the water swallowed his reflection and gave him something else instead. Not fear, not glory, but understanding. That light, true light, isn't bound by air or time. It exists wherever memory holds its breath long enough to be seen. So perhaps the lanterns beneath Charleston never burned in defiance. They burned because someone somewhere still needed to find their way home. The sea, vast, merciless, patient, kept that home for them. Each century it gives back a fragment, a piece of glass, a bolt, a record, a story whispered across generations. And though science will continue to measure, and skeptics will continue to doubt, The harbor will continue to glow unseen by the day, undeniable by the night. Because some truths don't live in documents, they live in echoes. And echoes never fade. So tonight, as you finish this story, picture the water lying still under the moon. Picture the faint amber shimmer drifting just beyond sight. And listen, not with ears, but with whatever part of you remembers things you've never lived. You'll hear it, the rhythm of 42 seconds, the breath of a harbor that has learned to remember. And if you ever find yourself in Charleston, walk down to the old piers before dawn. Lean over the railing. Wait, you might see nothing. You might see everything. But if the water stirs, if the surface trembles just once, you'll know the lanterns never went out. They simply went deeper, and somewhere in that quiet where salt and light intertwine, they're still burning, not for the past, but for whatever comes next. Because light, like history, doesn't disappear. It waits until someone is ready to see it again. And next we'll follow that same light as it travels inland, to the river that carried soldiers, civilians, and secrets through another kind of silence. A place they now call the harbor that spoke after the war.